This, I believe, is our first one for the spring quarter. Today we have Jayne Ifekwunigwe, who's going to be speaking on Roots and Roots, Rethinking Gendered African Diasporas in the Global Age. Jayne comes to us from School of Social Sciences, University of East London. She has a joint PhD in medical anthropology, which she got in 1993 from the University of California, Berkeley in San Francisco. Her dissertation was titled Scattered Belongings, the Cultural Paradoxes of Race, Nation, and Generation in the English African Diaspora. Her research interests, her teaching interests are many: critical mixed race theories and identities politics, global youth cultures, cultural tourisms and resistances in post-apartheid Camp Town, South Africa, textual strategies and feminist qualitative methodologies, book which came out in 1999 from Routledge, Scattered Belongings, Cultural Paradoxes of Race, Nation, and Gender. She has a reader which is forthcoming from Routledge as well called Mixed Race Studies Reader. Without further ado, Jayne Ifekwunigwe. I'm sorry for butchering your name here. Thank you.
Not at all.
Welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for coming. What I intend to do is speak to a work in progress. This is an ongoing enterprise which began during my graduate school days at Berkeley, where I petitioned to put the African diaspora on the agenda within anthropology as a culture area. Because at the time that I was working on my PhD, I was being sort of funneled in a particular direction to either choose the Caribbean or Sub-Saharan Africa or Latin America or Northwestern Europe, and I sort of wanted to encase them all within what I argued was a legitimate culture area, which is the African diaspora. So this is an ongoing conversation I've been having with myself and my colleagues. So what I intend to do is sort of summarize where I am at the moment with this ongoing project, show a video clip which I think illustrates what I refer to as the newer African diaspora or newer African diasporas, and then I'll sort of end with some closing remarks and then open it up for conversation and dialogue. Roots and Roots, Rethinking Gendered African Diasporas in the Global Age. We've inaugurated this new screen and the overhead projector, so the first page of what I'm about to say is actually up on the screen. The primary objective of this ongoing project is to draw the lived everyday Africa and its diasporas in all their heterogeneous and specific formations within, between, and without into the same discursive space. Is that humming or no? It's not making any noise. Okay, I guess we can leave that on.
Yep.
Okay. The project is comprised of 3 strands. In the first one, I reconfigure and reimagine temporal and spatial dimensions of the African diaspora within which there are compound and multiple forms. In other words, I locate my particular position on the African diaspora within a broader context, which includes obviously the work of my colleague and Ned Alpha sitting in the back, among others. Second, to test the relevance of this reformulation in contemporary everyday lived context, I discussed the newest layer of African diasporas which have resulted from recent dispersals from continental Africa. And this has been the most interesting aspect of the work that I'm doing, and I have ongoing disagreements with some of my colleagues as to whether these particular migrations about which I'm about to describe are considered economic migrations, or whether we can think of them as the newest layer of the African diaspora. Perhaps you have your own ideas about this, but I think the main sort of point of disagreement is how are we describing a diaspora, an African diaspora, and on what basis can we think of a particular exodus, can we think of a particular movement as a diaspora as opposed to a migration? And to what extent can we think of economic migrations as being comprised of the same conditions as were the older diasporas of slavery and other forms of forced dispersal? These include clandestine and dangerous migrations of West African women and men to Western Europe via Morocco and southern Spain, and this is what I'll be talking about today. This also entails the trafficking of West African, in particular Nigerian women, to Italy as part of the global sex trade, and that's another aspect of this project that I'm working on. Finally, by focusing on differential modes of continental African consumption, interpretation, translation, and ultimately indigenization of African diasporic expressive cultural forms, I address the ways in which the ideas, identifications, and political projects of Africa and the African diaspora are, and always have been, mutually constituted. In other words, what I'm saying here is that, obviously, how we imagine ourselves as subjects of the African diaspora, to a certain extent, are defined and dependent on how we define Africa as it is evolving and changing, and as a dynamic entity. And this is another aspect of my work about which I've had some interesting exchanges, which is around what happens to popular cultural forms when they travel. And in this section of the project, what I'm looking at is popular cultural forms, in particular music, and more specifically hip-hop. So what happens to hip-hop when it moves from African America to Europe, to New Zealand, to South Africa, to Senegal, to Ghana, to all these other places where you can find versions of hip-hop. And what I argue is there is actually a process that cultural forms go through in order to become what I call indigenized. And some of my colleagues would actually argue that it's not indigenization. What you have is mimicry. So in essence, what's happening on the ground in these local contexts is that Senegalese, South Africans, Maoris are hearing, receiving, consuming African American cultural forms, and then they're just mimicking what they think is African American music. And what I'm actually saying is, no, there's a process that cultural forms go through. The first stage might be consumption. The second stage then is translation. Then you have localization. Then you have indigenization, when in fact what you have is a local form of hip hop. Which in a Gambian case, for example, you have hip hop somehow speaking to, in terms of the content of the lyrics, speaking to how Islam is oppressive to young people and doesn't speak to a particular generation of young people. That's indigenization. Okay. That's my particular rant. Those are two aspects of this ongoing work about which I'm most passionate. Roots and roots, rehistoricizing, retracing, and replacing points of origins, multiple trajectories, and endless termina. As I said, what I'm doing now is just providing the framework for this project. Rethinking African diasporas necessitates the simultaneous pivoting of the conceptual axes of time, space, and shifting condition. And I make a distinction between diaspora with a big D and diaspora with a little d, and hopefully, within the context of what I'm about to say, that will make sense. So diaspora with a big D is the generic, singular, temporal, pre-Columbian, post-Columbian, contemporary, or newest form of the African diaspora. And I perhaps can speak more to why periodize the African diaspora in this way. And this goes back to how are we defining African diasporas. Why I make this distinction between a pre-Columbian versus a post-Columbian is we can point to that particular moment in time when this figure, this sort of mythological and historical figure known as Columbus sort of, in inverted commas, discovered this place called the New World, and whether we believe that other peoples, including Africans, circumnavigated the globe prior to this momentous journey. And also signals multiplicity, i.e. specific, localized, spatialized, and politicized configurations. And in this instance, I refer to the English African diaspora, diaspora with a big D, the American African diaspora, diaspora with a big D, or Brazilian African diaspora, to actually signal that we can talk about, we can spatialize, we can historicize the African diaspora, but we can also speak more specifically about the lived experiences of Africans who find themselves in Brazil, or Africans who find themselves in England, or Africans who find themselves in Cuba. Each of these older African diaspora communities has common cultural roots emanating from the African continent. These geographical and cultural groupings represent diverse outcomes to a common heritage of slavery, colonialism, underdevelopment, post-colonialism, and racism. In other words, the historical processes are similar, but how those historical processes manifest themselves in contemporary terms differ. There was a time when these macrosocial, economic, and historical processes created unifying but not unified diasporas. Across continua of time and space, African diasporas could be conceived of as dynamic, interlocking, and interdependent global networks of geopolitical spheres, each of whose localized constituencies were also sensitive to and impacted by the particular nation states of which they were a part. For examples, and I've already talked about this, the American African diaspora, the Brazilian African diaspora, the French African diaspora, the Dutch African diaspora, or the English African diaspora. Having said that, there have always been intra-diasporic stroke extra-colonial migrations of peoples of African descent, such as African Americans in Paris, or African students in the United States, such as Kwame Nkrumah or Nnamdi Azikiwe, which further complicates the cognitive remapping of the newest African diasporas. However, the long-term effects of underdevelopment in Africa, as well as Latin America and the Caribbean, coupled with the recent global rise of what I call American and European multinational imperial corporate complexes, have produced contemporary compound and complex African diasporas that do not necessarily or neatly correspond to former colonial European or Commonwealth status. So what I'm trying to say here is that it was possible in terms of mapping African diasporas to map either in terms of the moment of slavery, where you could sort of map diasporas in terms of particular slave routes, or it was possible to map diasporas in terms of particular post-colonial formations or colonial formations in terms of the British colonized this particular place, this particular place, this particular place. So colonially and post-colonially, you find Ghanaians and Nigerians, and in Britain, you find Senegalese and Guadeloupans in France, and you find Curaçaoans in Holland, and Surinamese in Holland, and so on. So, but in recent, with globalization, among other forces, it's not so simplistic and not so straightforward to describe these mappings, and this is what I'm talking about here. That these, the globalization and other processes have produced contemporary, compound, and complex African diasporas that do not necessarily or neatly correspond to former colonial European or Commonwealth status. The complexity of the constituent parts of these newer hyphenated diasporic signifiers forces a rethinking of conventional forms of diasporic space, process, and condition. And I'm just going to give you some examples here. Many of which I've actually experienced myself or had exchanges with these particular constituents on my travels. For example, through both voluntary migration and forced displacement, and notice this tension between, are we talking about forced migration, or are we talking about individuals migrating of their own volition? And to what extent can we locate these so-called voluntary migrations within the locus of the African diaspora? Nuer, Minnesota, hence Sudanese-American African diaspora. Senegalese traders in Thessaloniki, Greece. Senegalese Greek African diaspora. Nigerian migrant sex workers in Florence, Italy. Nigerian Italian African diaspora. Somali in Ottawa, Canada. Somali Canadian African diaspora. Okay, what I'd like to do now is I've sort of set up this notion that we now are talking about compound and complex newer African diasporas, is to screen kind of a visual extract of what I'm talking about here. Before I do that, I'd like to throw some numbers at you. What I'm going to be screening is an extract of a documentary called Exodus, which some of you may have seen last August on CNN, the documentary by the Sierra Leonean filmmaker. Someone's nodding their head. Has anyone else seen that? No? It was actually originally aired on Channel 4 in November 2000, and I noticed when I was here last summer that they were going to be screening it on CNN in August. What I'd like to do, because the documentary doesn't actually do this, is to provide a context, for this particular exodus. There are a lot of bodies in that Saharan desert. Sometimes you see bones by the roadside. They are all Africans heading for Europe. says Ken Umoli, a Nigerian who survived the trek from West Africa across the Sahara en route to Tangier, where he is waiting to be transported across the Strait of Gibraltar to Tarifa, Spain, the gateway to Fortress Europe. And what was interesting about this clip as well, the longer version of this, and you probably remember this, is that the camarades, as the filmmaker refers to them, don't actually talk specifically about going to Spain or going to Britain or going to France. They talk about Europe, as this formation, that they are, that they're seeking, which symbolizes perhaps prosperity, greater freedom, and so on. In the past decade, at least 3,000, and this is my term, African boat people, or in Spain, they refer to them as pateras because of the boats that they use to travel across the strait, have drowned attempting the passage across the straits, described as the largest mass grave in Europe. Spanish tourism officials have begun to complain about the bodies which periodically wash up on Spanish beaches, which they fear will begin to damage tourism. Spain is the third most popular holiday destination in the world. Since January 2001, 10,000 Africans have been detained by Spanish authorities after making the treacherous journey across the Strait of Gibraltar. The 14-kilometer or 8.7-mile stretch of water, imagine 8.7, I mean, it's not, you'll see it actually, but it's not that much distance. The water is actually quite choppy, so it sometimes takes longer than that to make that passage, and a lot of people don't reach the other end. Separating the tip of Morocco and the southern Spanish coastline. If the waters are calm, the crossing only takes 35 minutes. The pateras pay on average $1,000 to traffickers who frequently also transport drugs such as cocaine, hashish, and heroin. 2/3 of those intercepted are North African, Moroccan in particular, and you'll notice that I'm actually, sort of making a particular statement here in terms of talking about North Africans, and obviously those of you who have a historical context here know the relationship between the long-standing relationship between Morocco and Spain. And in my concluding remarks, I'll share some of my own experiences in Spain in this regard, and the ways in which the Spanish have a very short memory and actually have erased that aspect of the genealogy, so they don't actually acknowledge the Moorish influence. And we all know, that there's an African presence in Spain, and there has been until they were expelled. So 2/3 of those intercepted are North African, Moroccan in particular. The remaining 1/3 are sub-Saharan Africans from Senegal, Mali, the Gambia, Cote d'Ivoire, Nigeria, and Sierra Leone. And just another interesting sort of tangent is I was invited to give an address for a conference in southern Spain last May, and I was having conversations with my colleagues about this particular issue. And why is it that the Moroccans are so demonized? And I had my theory about this, because they said, oh, we don't mind having West Africans, because they're prepared to do the menial labor, but we don't like Moroccans. And whenever there's any sort of incident or a rape or a mugging or burglary, it's the Moroccans are the ones that are singled out. And my theory was, is it because phenotypically, from a physical standpoint, there's not that much difference between a Spanish person and a Moroccan person, so it's very difficult to keep one's tabs on Moroccan, whereas with West Africans, phenotypically, particularly Nigerians, Gambians, Sierra Leoneans, there's a physical difference between them. It's no, that's not it at all. There is a deportation agreement between Morocco and Spain, which means Moroccans are deported within 24 hours. There is no such agreement between Spain and sub-Saharan African countries. Sub-Saharan Africans are generally served with a 15-day expulsion order, which is erratically enforced. Many of the latter, that is, sub-Saharan Africans, disappear. The lucky ones make their way to other European destinations. And at the moment, obviously, because most West Africans don't speak Spanish, the final destination is not by choice Spain. They would rather go to other places where they have established networks, such as Italy or Britain or Germany. Others remain in Spain, hoping they will obtain legal residence permits, which will allow them to work. And that was also very interesting from my standpoint, because in this particular region of Spain where the conference was being held. I mean, I speak Spanish, and so I was able to communicate with inverted commas, the indigenous community, and was sort of wandering around. And I think I bemused a lot of my Spanish hosts, because they were used to engaging with West Africans, who were pateras, who were there, trying to receive assistance and so on, and they couldn't really figure out how I had learned Spanish so quickly, and where I acquired the suede suit I was wearing and so on. They didn't really know how to place me, and the exchanges were interesting, to say the least. And not very pleasant, I must say as well. Because I think Spain hasn't really learned from other European countries in terms of how to best deal with, in inverted commas, the immigration problem. And even though, and I'll talk about this later, that there's a shrinking labor force, which necessarily suggests that they need migrant labor. That they actually make a distinction between whom they consider the right migrant and who is not. And from a racialized standpoint, they don't particularly want West Africans or Moroccans. The unlucky eke out livings as best they can, which may entail sex work, drug dealing, or grueling agricultural labor. A shrinking population and economic boom suggests that Spain will need 12 million immigrants over the next 30 years. However, in 2004, Spain will have completed, and what I'm addressing here will, I think, have more resonance once you actually see the clip. Spain will have completed the installation of a $120 million radar system that will form a 550-kilometer electronic wall across the Mediterranean. The system will be able to detect boats at distances of up to 11 kilometers. So they're creating their own, sort of high-tech fortress to keep Moroccans and sub-Saharan Africans out. By 2015, it is estimated, nevertheless, it is estimated that between 15 and 20 million migrants will have made a bid for Western Europe via Spanish territory. And what's actually happening is that once it's identified that they've closed off or they've increased the surveillance in one part, they actually find others. So that the preferred point of entry is actually via the Canary Islands now, as opposed to across the strait. And I think it's going to continue, because obviously I think this is what I call about as the racialized politics of exigency and exclusion, because people's, and this goes back to what I was saying earlier about how can we not think about the current situation, the current crisis in West Africa that is compelling these individuals to risk life and limb, to make this dangerous journey, is not part of the African diasporas, not the newest layer, for lots of obvious reasons. I refer to this as the paradoxical and racialized politics of exigency and exclusion. In order to cope with labor shortfalls, European countries such as Spain distinguish between the right and wrong sort of immigrant. That is, the gates are wide open for skilled workers, whereas the doors are slammed shut for unskilled workers from developing countries, otherwise known as the brain drain. And what I thought was also interesting when I was in Spain last spring, that there are certain rural villages wherein schools are running the risk of being closed because they don't have enough Spanish children to keep them open. So mayors of these particular villages are actually going to Eastern Europe and recruiting families to come and settle in Spain, because obviously an Eastern European from a physical standpoint is likely to fit in better than, once again, a West African or a Moroccan. So here they have this flood of people coming, across the strait, whom they could teach Spanish, whom they could, give them the skills and the housing and so on to settle, but they're, instead going to Spain, or in certain instances to Latin America, and trying to get individuals to come and populate the country. Thousands of British, in addition to this, thousands of British and Northern European expatriates retire to Spain every year without difficulty. As I've mentioned, Eastern European immigrants are welcomed and in certain instances actively recruited. On the other hand, North Africans, West Africans, and Latin Americans with a little bit too much brown migrants who frequently enter illegally experience racial discrimination and hostility from the indigenous Spanish population, as I say, who have reinvented themselves as white. And that was also what was interesting while I was there, is the emergence of a particular problematic discourse around white supremacy, that wasn't there before. So what I'd like to do now, to contextualize what I've been talking about here, is to show you a short clip from Exodus, which I think in a visual way will illustrate some of what I'm talking about here. Okay. Okay, I have just a couple of concluding remarks, and then open it up for discussion. And obviously, at this juncture, I'm speaking as an anthropologist as well. In terms of this particular moment, how difficult it is to think of culture areas and field sites in the conventional way. No longer can we construct the fieldwork site as exclusively singular, local, and fixed. Rather than mapping specific diasporic communities onto particular post-colonial landscapes, the analytical framework within which we must build new theories is one based on the simultaneity of transnational existences and of post-national life worlds and material worlds, rooted in multiple fusions and confusions. More recent migrants and refugees from continental Africa have different shared narratives of home, community, longing, and belonging than their predecessors. The myth of return is to a place they recently knew, rather than to a place they can only imagine. Thank you.
I had to come in a few moments late, so forgive me if you've already touched upon this, and thank you so much for commenting. The parallels with such situations as the Haitian boat people in recent years in the United States are so obvious, and I was just wondering if you have made any thoughts about those kinds of juxtapositions.
It's interesting that this question came up the last time I gave this talk, which was at the African Studies Association meetings in Houston. I think in terms of how I'm reconfiguring or rethinking African diasporas, it creates a nice sort of connection in terms of the relationship between the American African diaspora, the Caribbean African diaspora, and then obviously these newer African diasporas that are entering Europe via these particular means. But beyond that, I haven't sort of re-theorized or made that connection. But in terms of the political conditions, the means by which the outcomes, there are stark similarities, and obviously also in terms of what happens to these particular individuals once they reach land, in terms of how they're treated. Obviously, the United States has different immigration policies than in Spain at the moment.
Because from the standpoint of diaspora, it seems that one of the most striking things that's happening around the world in these border areas that have been created is that we have populations of people now who have to, after a single trip, completely reconfigure themselves.
Yes. And I don't know if you were here for the bit where I was talking about the differential policies, how Spain is actually.
Oh yes, I'm
yes,
familiar.
okay, yes. And also the fact that Spain isn't the final destination for most, particularly the West Africans, that they actually want to reach destinations where they already have networks in place, which are obviously primarily Britain, Italy, Spain, and that in those contexts, they're there illegally as well.
For example, the idea of being an African American now is being reconfigured because of the tremendously complex array of diasporic
And that's
subjects.
what I'm trying to argue, and I'm glad that you're acknowledging that, because in other conversations I've had with colleagues that there's been an unwillingness to rethink what African diaspora means. And I think the locus classicus African diaspora obviously is that of slavery. And I think it's difficult for people to kind of rethink contemporary circumstances and what's happening in Africa at the moment, and how there are similarities in terms of people's need. I mean, if one is the situation as us as a trained certified accountant, who could not find work in Nigeria. If you're in a situation, where you can't afford to house and clothe and feed yourself, and you're making this treacherous journey, which involves, it's a multi-stage journey. A lot of it on foot, from Nigeria to Tangier. That's not, a decision that's entered into lightly. And I think, and as you say, obviously, what happens when these individuals reach wherever it is they're going, that they are immediately sort of positioned as African diasporic subjects.
I'm going to play devil's advocate here for
Okay.
a minute. Okay. And again, as a sociologist who is heavily influenced by demographic data, and in fact was trained to sort of look at demographic data to possibly give us insights into cultural forms that flow from demographic shifts and moves. And I think you're absolutely right in terms of globalization and sort of what's been happening. The example you show us here with Morocco and Spain, and the example of the Haitian refugees coming over to the U.S. But the question is this: this phenomenon is clearly happening, where you're having sort of a mixing and an increasing complexity of various diasporas in different places, whereby I guess the old colonial relationships no longer quite define who's where and when. However, it seems to me there are certain places in the world where you still have, I guess, just for lack of a better term, more of a nucleus that might be almost read off of that colonial history than other places that, for example, the metropoles where slavery didn't exist, there. It existed in the colonies. So you have, I guess, a situation whereby, a little bit of immigration or a relatively small amount of immigration can create an incredibly complex diaspora in terms of, I guess, just sheer numbers. Then you might have in a place where you have this huge population that's been there, at least their descendants have been there for a long time. I think of the U.S. in particular. And this goes to so I'm sure some of the reluctance of people to concede that point, vis-a-vis U.S. race relations and what African American means in this context. Again, it's a very complex group, of course. But I guess the question is there enough of a population in terms of numbers to make it qualitatively different than some of these other places? Not to say that it might not become more like those places as more of this happens, but are we there yet in this context?
Interesting question. Well, what I'm actually arguing at this stage is because I think what makes it difficult to configure these newer African diasporas is A, they're mobile, B, they're illegal, so it's difficult to quantify, and C, that they are, as you say, hybrid and diverse in ways that, obviously in terms of settlement patterns and generations and history and so on. And for example, in the U.S. context, it's easier, to have a sense. That all I'm at this stage arguing is that these particular movements be recognized and acknowledged as newer African diasporas. The question of how to quantify and name is one that I'm not sure. I'm not sure I can take on. I mean, there is just as a plug for an anthology that will be coming out very shortly, to which I've contributed a chapter. There was a very interesting symposium. I participated in this symposium, was it May of 2000, called New African Diasporas. And there's an anthology coming out, published by Routledge any time now, edited by my colleague Koser, K-O-S-E-R, and the book is, the collection is called New African Diasporas. So yes, I mean, that's at this stage, all I'm really advocating, because I feel that, and I'm sorry, I don't know your name. Elise, yeah. We were having an exchange about, she asked if I was going to be talking about the whole reparations issue, and I said, actually, that wasn't specifically the focus of my talk. But obviously, there's a lot of, yes, there was a lot of, yes, there's a lot of activity and debate around this issue in the UK at the moment. And my position, and call it simplistic, and perhaps it speaks to my own location as someone who, was raised here, was raised in Nigeria, also raised in England, and now lives back in England. But I feel that, obviously you had the Negritude movement, and you had Pan-Africanism that created some kind of unity among African peoples, and I feel some of that is lost. So, call it romantic, call it nostalgia, but I'm advocating what I refer to as a Pan-African diasporic consciousness, which includes, sort of acknowledging these other and newer African diasporic formations, as well as, I think, in addition to, this steadfast notion of defining the African diaspora exclusively in terms of the slave narrative. I think there's a reluctance and an unwillingness to acknowledge the impact of imperialism and colonialism and how that created particular diasporic formations. And so that's why I began the paper in the way that I did, with these different sort of configurations, because I think, and perhaps our colleague, Paul Gilroy was in his own way with the formation of the Black Atlantic, was trying to argue that in terms of acknowledging, the complexity of these historical processes and how they created, and I think, and it's also just in a sense from my travels, what always, and I don't know, whether people want to suggest that this is it's more the impact of the media than anything else. But what always surprises me is, when I travel, walking down the street, having the sense of cognitive dissonance, because I'm interacting with people who look like me but who speak Dutch or speak French, or soon will be speaking Spanish, and that, in and of itself is kind of a testament to what I'm referring to as this, Pan-African diasporic experience. So that's, I'm hearing what you're saying, and what I'm really more advocating is kind of a rethinking of what we think of as the African diaspora, and this
thinking
notion
of that diaspora as a process, rather than these fixed objects.
Exactly, and rather than as this, which obviously is not discounting, that most notable notion of the African diaspora, the locus, what I call the locus classicus African diaspora, of slavery. But I think just I'm advocating an opening up of that discourse.
You get no argument from me. I think that's absolutely. It's not simply what you're talking about. But if you look at during the period of the slave trade, which, first of all, if you expand it, as you know, from out of the Atlantic into other parts of the world, but also, one of the phenomena that a number of people are studying now is, for example, the role of African sailors. There's that work in blackjacks in the Atlantic, but there's people like Jayne work in the Indian Ocean. There's other work. There's a couple of papers at our conference, in fact, one of them talking about circulation of this, and this actually plugs right into, and some of those people were enslaved, but some of them were free. And it also plugs into your whole notion of, which I also, I was just saying it last quarter in classes and lecturing about Diaspora, about the transference of culture and the indigenization of certain forms of culture. And I wasn't necessarily, I'm not big on globalization, because I think it's a process that's been going on for about 500 or 600 years.
It's the newest
so
manifestation.
But there's and there's some of the again, since I've just been reading these papers for our conference, but it's stuff from before there's a circulation of musical forms moving around, which you can trace, like as you can trace hip hop, but which over time become very much localized. And so I think that what you're, and it's the other thing that's also interesting about your work in this particular bit is that here's a case where, I mean, is one in the Black Atlantic or not? I mean, one of the real drawbacks of Gilroy's work, of course, is it's so resolutely North Atlantic and Anglophone. And here's something where you've got Nigerians and Sierra Leoneans and Gambians who don't have any connection to Iberia, sort of suddenly going across a quote French and Arabic speaking area and then ending up in a place where they're part of the Atlantic. Are they part of the Atlantic diaspora? Are they part of the old Saharan roots? I mean, it's the one of the phrases I've liked is Ibrahim Sundiata talks about in one of these short pieces, talks about overlapping diasporas. That's a term that one sees in other places too, but I think it's a way we have to think of this. And again, obviously the slave, both not just in the Atlantic, but in the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean world, the slave trade is still fundamental to that. But I think that what you're saying is absolutely right and sort of spot on. And I'm not surprised. I mean, and understand why people are reluctant to. Also, that in the literature of the diaspora, you've got it's been so dominated by perspectives from North America that that's another problem. Sort of that people kind of have a hard time even understanding that they're that they're black folk. I always show in my class. I show the stuff that I have from India.
Right.
You know.
Like what?
African folks doing it. They're there too.
Yes.
So and it is the other one final point that you said is really interesting was that you're kind of the elision or the active suppression of a recognition of, except for some romantic notion perhaps of an African influence in Spain. You see the same thing in Portugal. There's after the Revolution of the Carnations in '75. In the '60s, you didn't see the only black folk you saw in Portugal, and they were all in Lisbon basically, were students. Angolan students, Mozambican students, you can talk to them. And there was no particular prejudice against them because they were all Portuguese speaking. And it actually goes to your point about demographics. And I this is actually, I wasn't the one who kind of ascertained this, but when I was doing research there, it was at the same time that Walter Rodney was there. We were running mates and SOAS together. So I asked Walter, I said, do you find that people give you a hard time because you're black? And he said, no. He said, I speak Portuguese. And he said, so therefore, I'm civilizado. I'm okay. But ever since then, if you go in certain parts of Lisbon, I mean, right after '75, you not only had large numbers of Africans coming back, Angolans in particular, who had sort of were either on the outs politically or actually bought the Portuguese lie that they were somehow Portuguese. But you also had what were called retornados. You had white settlers like the Pied Noir coming back. So you had a different kind of racism that was built in the colony. Plus you had a lot more black folks. And so there's one of my favorite places in Lisbon is a neighborhood up in the Bairro Alto. There's a street called Rua Poço dos Negros, which is Poço is a well, but it means a neighborhood. And it clearly dates to the time when Lisbon in the 16th century had a big black population, which has been studied, we know about. In the 60s, when I was doing research there weren't any black. It's now completely Cabo Verde. So there's kind of been a re-coming back to that area, and repopulating of it. I don't think that that's why they populated it, but so there's some really interesting things like that, and the Spanish thing. South of Spain must be peculiar.
Yes, it is. And what's interesting as well, this is a bit of a tangent in terms of the language issue and how language legitimates you. At the ASA, it's interesting, individual who's based in Germany, and he gave this very interesting paper on how Yoruba has become the lingua franca, for African immigrants in Germany, as opposed to their taking on Germany that actually use kind of hybridized Yoruba as a mode of communication, that unites these disparate African communities.
I didn't
Yes.
see that. Because that's very much, I mean, when you think about how Yoruba, but other African languages sort of become, got spread as a national language among nations in the Americas. Clearly not everybody who ended up speaking Nago or something like that was Yoruba, but it was partly demographics and partly other things, I'm sure, too. So, yeah, it's fascinating.
Did you have some sort of general idea of what kind of numbers there are for this new sort of? I know there's like 500,000 in LA.
Yeah, I mean, as I said once again, what makes all of this very difficult, and another, as I said, this is a work in progress. I'm on steady leave at the moment, so I have particular publication commitments, and so this is really what I want to be working on at the moment, and eventually, I want to put this all together as a monograph. But the other, sort of aspect of this that I was not sure whether I decided not to talk about, but I think is equally as compelling, are the what I referred to as the diasporas that have new African diasporas that have resulted on the basis of the trafficking of Nigerian women.
Exactly,
Sex
that's
workers.
what I was thinking
Yes.
of.
And as I said, what makes all this very difficult, and in that area, you have statistics that range from 5,000 to 500,000, and all of this is very difficult to quantify because of the issue of illegality, that they're not documented, so it makes
That was primarily to Italy, wasn't it?
Pardon?
Weren't those women primarily going to Italy?
In terms of this particular, yes, these are primarily in Italy, and more specifically in Florence.
Florence.
Yes, and I mean I have a whole. You don't get me started on that one because
I heard also maybe.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe also maybe the article is saying there were a lot of Eastern Europeans who were coming in as prostitutes in the same area.
Yes, it's Eastern Europeans. It's actually Eastern Europeans.
And who were the madams,
The madams are actually, in the Nigerian instance, on former Nigerian sex workers who retired and are now, But also, and this goes back to the really important question that I still remember for the NYU conference that you asked about internal diasporas in terms of on the continent, because obviously in the case of Nigeria you have a massive Nigerian population in South Africa, which is actually where I've been doing field work since '96, and you have similar sort of instances of trafficking of young women for the purposes of sex trade.
Did you say how long that particular film was? Because you didn't go to
yes,
the
no,
end.
it's with adverts. It's about 55 minutes. And yes, if you email me, I can give you the details of the filmmaker. He's based in London. Sorry, Samara. But as I said, it did, because I know one person actually saw that it was screened on CNN last August.
And are the people who go to the European countries, I know since we just spoke about women, but are there more men than women that actually go? Or does it matter? You talked about
well, this
gender.
is what's also interesting as well, yes, and I didn't really speak to that as much as I could, which is to say that in an interesting sort of way, women are mobilized on that journey, and in certain instances, if the particular travelers don't have enough money to make the complete passage, they'll actually use the women travelers as collateral, so they will.
I see.
And so, in certain instances, and this I found interesting as well. I had this very kind of passionate exchange with one of my colleagues at this conference around this whole issue of women pateras, because their position was that these women were specifically getting themselves pregnant en route, because they knew that when they reached Spanish shores, that if you arrive pregnant, that they can't deport you, and your child immediately becomes a Spanish citizen, as does the mother. You know, so that there actually are. So I heard two versions of the story. One version of the story was that these women were being raped by Moroccan officials, and the other position was that they were actually strategically getting themselves pregnant because they knew, you know, en route, you know, that their child would be granted citizenship, as would be they. I can recommend a wonderful. I mean, as I said, this is very, very new terrain. You know, so that in terms of the literature, there isn't a lot written on this. What I can recommend is, I've already recommended New African Diasporas, but I can also recommend a wonderful book written by a journalist, Jeremy Harding, called The Uninvited: Refugees at the Rich Man's Gate, which actually, you know, gives you all sorts of numbers and statistics in terms of, and some very harrowing case studies, you know, in terms of the measures people will take to actually reach Fortress Zero.
Could I just ask one fast question? I know we're over time. When we look at the Mexican-American situation, the term that we use is coyotes. Is there a term that has developed for the comrades?
Yes. As I said, the term that I heard in Spain was pateras, and that's to refer to that's what they call the rubber boats that they travel in. Pateras.
The people, though, who
they call them pateras.
They
call them
also
pateras.
called.
Yes,
oh,
they
I
call them
see.
pateras.
Okay.
Yes.
Any last question? No?
We wanted the title of The Uninvited at the Rich Man's Gate. Was
And
that the
Jeremy
name of it?
Harding is the author. The title is The Uninvited, and then the subtitle is Refugees at the Rich Man's Gate. I also, speaking of books, this is a plug for Scattered Belongings. I have postcards here if anyone would like a copy of them.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, this is. And I also have cards if anyone wants to email me with further questions.